Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. So I thought again I'd do something different and this time take a look at one of India's most popular historic and fiction movies and see how fictional is this history. So the movie that we are going to take a look at today is Padmaavat, which came out in 2018, directed by Sanjay Leela Bhansali. It was a huge, massive hit, and again, not surprising because it is a lavish production, as all Sanjay Leela Bhansali productions are, and it stars Ranbir Singh as Alauddin Khilji, Deepika Padukone as Rani Padmavati, and Shahid Kapoor as Rahul Ratan Sen, with a lot of the whole bevy of supporting actors in very different characters. We'll discuss the performances and the nuances of the characters as we go along. But I thought we'd take a look at the actual historical period and the characters and the events that are depicted in the film and compare it with what actually happened. The movie is based on the epic poem Padmaavat written by Malik Jayasi in the 16th century, who was a Sufi poet. So it is not based on any actual historical documents, but a historical fiction work in itself. So it's twice removed from actual history. Well, thrice removed because it was written down in the 16th century, which is 3 centuries after all of the events that are described in the poem happened. So it's quite interesting to see it through that perspective. And again, filtered through the perspective of Sanjay Leela Bhansali and his production company in 2018, which was in the period when a new historical narrative was picking up steam in India. So that is clearly on display in the movie. So hopefully you'll enjoy this nitpicking historical review of the movie. It's not really a review. I enjoyed the movie, but we are here to discuss the history depicted in the movie and see how actual history compares to the history or historical fiction depicted in the movie Padmaavat. So I'm hoping to do a few parts of this series because I don't want to overwhelm you with historical information. As much as I love history and talking about it, I don't think anybody wants to listen to me talk for 2 hours about the movie. I could probably do a commentary, but I don't think anybody's going to watch that. So we'll break it down into little parts to be able to discuss the different historical events, the historical characters, the actions they took, the decisions they made, the way they are depicted in the movie, and how true they are to actual history. We'll discuss all that. So welcome to part one of our discussion of the movie Padmaavat. Is it historical or is it just hysterical?
ये देखिए खिलजियों के सरदार समझ नहीं आता ये दिल्ली से गजनी क्या सिर्फ खाने और सोने के लिए आए हैं
शरीफ पाशा ये हमें लेने आए हैं इनका इरादा है कि हम सब मिलकर दिल्ली सल्तनत पर हमला कर दें
So the movie begins with a setup that is itself historically inaccurate. The movie is set in Afghanistan in the beginning scenes, and we see Jalaluddin Firuz Khalji just sitting there waiting to invade India in his own words and take over the Sultanate, which in fact, if you look at the actual history of the period, is not accurate at all because Jalaluddin Firuz didn't have any intentions of taking over the Delhi Sultanate. He was, at the time, invited by the last Sultan of the Shamsi or slave or Mamluk dynasty to come and help him keep control of his throne. But there was factionalism going on at the court at the time between the Shamsi nobles, who were Ilbari Turks, who considered themselves the elites and who considered themselves above the rest of the milieu of the court. And then there were the Khalji faction, who were Turko-Afghans, who were not pure Turks like the Ilbaris. So this factional infighting resulted in the enthronement of Jalaluddin Firuz Khalji, who chucked the last Sultan of the Shamsi dynasty out the window into the Yamuna River. So it wasn't a peaceful takeover, but it wasn't something that he planned and enacted. So yeah, the beginning first few minutes of the movie itself is entirely inaccurate. So I think that gives you an idea of what kind of movie this is. This isn't a historical movie. This is not even historical fiction. This is closer to mythology and fantasy than it is to actual history. But that's part and parcel of the movie because it is not based on actual history. It is based on a poem written by a Sufi saint in the 16th century, so about 300 years after the fact, and is based on hearsay, and it's trying to tell us, teach the audience certain lessons about human emotions and passions, and channeling all that through Alauddin Khilji's conquest of Chittor. So we have to keep that in mind when we watch this movie, because it is not history, it is not historical fiction, it is historical fantasy based on an allegorical poem that barely touches upon actual history. So we meet Alauddin Khilji. At this point, his name is not Alauddin. His name is Ali Gurshasp. He was a son of a brother of Jalaluddin Firuz. When the brother died, long before Jalaluddin became the Sultan of Delhi, he adopted these kids of his brother and raised them in his own family. So in the introduction scene, we are kind of seeing this rough, grungy, kind of unkempt character, which is in line with the perception of the Turkic and Persianate sultans of Delhi as very uncouth, uncivilized people, particularly in the current political climate in India, which is, again, not entirely related to actual history. These were Persianate people. They were highly civilized, but in a different kind of sphere and culture than the Indic one, which was based on Sanskrit and Brahmanism and Buddhism and the Shramanic cultures and all that, and the Dravidian sphere as well. So it's very different from the Persian sphere, but these were all equally cultured people, but they interacted in very different ways. So the introduction, again, we see how the ideology that the filmmakers had at that time in 2018, it was trying to push that agenda. It's very clear in the depiction of the costume and the general look of Ali Gurshasp. And Ghazni is shown here as kind of an unkempt mud fort kind of situation, which is more accurate to maybe Assyria in 1500 BCE, rather than, Ghazni, which was a great capital of the Ghaznavids and the Ghurids during the 13th century and the centuries before when this movie is taken.
बड़ा शातिर है, एक नायाब चीज देकर दूसरी मांग रहा है।
अल्लाह की बनाई हर नायाब चीज पर सिर्फ अलाउद्दीन का हक है।
कौन कहता है?
So again, there's hints of history in this scene. We are introduced to Meher-un-Nisa, who is the daughter of Jalaluddin Firuz, and Alauddin, or Ali Gurshasp, asks for her hand in marriage. In reality, again, this marriage took place long before the Khalji revolution, which put Jalaluddin Firuz on the throne of Delhi. It happened long before. So the marriage alliance was probably recommended by Jalaluddin as a way to unite the two lines of his father's dynasty and lineage, right? So it was a way to unify Jalaluddin's own line and unite it with the other line of his brother who had died. And we know that this wasn't a love match, because in historical sources we have detailed accounts of the wife of Alauddin, who was the daughter of Jalaluddin, who was his principal wife, at least in the early part of his reign, being extremely jealous of his other wives and actually conspiring against them, and having the kind of Hindi daily soap kind of arguments and scenes with them, particularly with another wife of Alauddin's called Mahru. So this was definitely not a love match. There was no love lost between them. There is also hints that Alauddin eventually wanted to take over the Sultanate and, rebel against his uncle because of the unhappy marriage that he had with his uncle's daughter and her mother. So these two ladies were significantly antagonistic to Alauddin and his other brother. So definitely not a love match, and definitely not the kind of relationship that's shown here. And it is also depicted as kind of, Alauddin as being very licentious and lascivious in his actions. As far as we know, Alauddin wasn't the kind of person who went around canoodling with women all over the place, especially on the night before his wedding. He had several wives, as did every monarch in India ever. And that's the way dynasties were continued. Marriage alliances were important. But he is not known to be somebody who spent too much time in the attempt to get more wives or to spend a lot of time in the harem or the zanana. Unlike a lot of the other sultans who are depicted as such in the historical record itself. If Alauddin was that kind of character, it would have been documented. But we don't have too many instances of his licentiousness in any of the historical records. So that's a deviation from the actual historical record. But again, it makes sense in this context because the movie is trying to tell you a certain POV, and it requires him to be the kind of womanizer that needs to be depicted in this way. So it makes sense, but it's not based on any history that we do know of. So this is the scene where we're introduced to the other two important characters in the movie. We already met the antagonist, which is Alauddin Khilji. Now we meet the tentative protagonists, which is Rani Padmini or Princess Padmini in this scene, and Rawal Ratan Sen. So it is set in Sinhala, which is standing in for Sri Lanka. So if the movie doesn't itself say, I don't think, why he is in Sri Lanka at this point of time. In reality, again, for one, Ratan Sen, or the character he's based on, Ratnasimha, wasn't the king of his little fortress of Chittor during this period of time. In the 1290s, when Jalaluddin was the Sultan of Delhi, somebody else was the head of the family in Chittor. He doesn't become the king of Chittor until 1301, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So again, well after even Alauddin becomes the Sultan. And he wouldn't have been in Lanka because it is a considerable distance from Rajputana where he would have been, and they don't have the kind of resources to travel that far, for one thing. Second, being a self-identified Kshatriya, he would not have allowed himself to cross the ocean because it was forbidden by the Manusmriti and other such texts. So again, it's a conflict of interest right there. But again, for the sake of the story, in the actual poem, I think they communicate through tuti, or a parrot. So there's a talking bird in the poem. Thankfully, it's not in the movie, but it doesn't make it any less fantastical, because here we have a Rajput king in Buddhist Lanka hunting, apparently, which, again, did not happen.
हमारे साथ मेवाड़ चलेंगी पद्मावती, हमारी पत्नी बनकर।
So in the movie, we see the princess of Sinhala being seduced by this Rajput king and him proposing marriage and then marrying her and taking her home to Chittor. The unlikelihood of such a thing happen is extraordinary, because for one thing, the Rajputs are relatively newer lineages and dynasties on the scene compared to the kings of Anuradhapura, which was the dynasty in Lanka at the time. They had been existing since the time of the Mauryas, at least. So at least the 2nd century, 3rd century BCE. So this is the 13th century now. So it's quite a few centuries. The Rajputs don't come into existence until at least after the Gupta period. So that's again around 5th, 6th century CE. So that's quite a big difference in timelines. So I don't think an Anuradhapura princess would have been sent to a Rajput king or prince at this point of time in history, because the difference in stature would have been quite different. And again, why a Rajput would be in Sri Lanka, I simply don't understand. There is no possibility, there is no reason. The only dynasty that we do really know about going to Sri Lanka like that are the imperial Cholas of Kanchipuram and later Tanjavur and Gangaikonda Cholapuram. So again, unless it's one of them, sure, but the Rajputs didn't have any navy to speak of that I'm aware of. So I don't know what he's doing in Anuradhapura or Sinhala to say. Singha, that's the word they use, Singha, not Sinhala.
हिंदू कमल दिवाकर, रघुकुल सूरज, मेवाड़ प्रभाकर, महारावण रतन सिंह जी दरबार में पधार रहे हैं।
I have to comment on the magnificence on display here. The set design is fantastic. The costumes are beautiful. The lighting, the direction, all of that is really good, as it should be in any fantasy film, right? This is like the Lord of the Rings or the Harry Potter series, but for India. We don't have any of that. We have historical epics, which are basically fantasy epics taking place in a historical setting. So the Chittorgarh fort, which is depicted in the movie, it's fantastic because it is a fantasy, because the fort that we know of and see today was only constructed by the 16th, 17th century after the Rajputs associated themselves with the Mughals and had gained more access to far more riches than they had before. So in the 13th century and the 14th century, when the Chittor campaign takes place, the fort that existed at the time was only the western part of the fort that we see today. So it's a really tiny portion compared to what is depicted in the movie. But again, it is a choice made to, give lavish sets and give it that extravagance that we deserve in a huge Bollywood production like this. Musicals usually require grandiose sets, and you can't show, a little dilapidated or old fort, regardless of how formidable it actually was. And if you look at the set design, you can see Islamic designs on there that only entered into Rajput styles with their association with the Mughals. So there was a cross-pollination happening during the Akbar reign, when Akbar started building forts and palaces in a Hindu style, while the Rajputs who were in his court started adopting certain Islamic styles in their constructions as well. So that's why the arches look the way they do, the windows look the way they do. Those are styles borrowed from the Persianate style that was used in Islamic architecture, while the Islamic architecture of the Mughals borrowed heavily from Indian styles like temple buildings and Jain structures and Buddhist structures that heavily influenced the Mughal style. So that's why it's a syncretic structure. So while it is beautiful, it is not based on historical reality. So that's it for part 1, where we discuss the historical movie Padmaavat and see how historical it is. Hopefully you enjoyed this episode. If you did, let me know. If there are any questions, do let me know as well. If there are any points in the first part of the movie that we discussed that you think could be discussed in more detail, do let me know. I can talk about it a lot more. I am working on the second volume of The Lords of India, and I'm dealing with the reign of Alauddin Khilji at the moment anyway, so it's fresh in my memory, so I should be able to give you a lot more information. Keep an eye out for part 2, which shouldn't be out too much later than next week. So until then, have a great day.